And today we are continuing a series of talks that we've called The Real Real. The Real Real. And the idea being that behind some of the highlight real stories of faith you see in the Bible, in particular from Hebrews chapter 11, that there are real details, R-E-A-L, that can help us understand better what it looks like to live and walk in faith. And Hebrews chapter 11, verse 29, at the start of these talks, I didn't think that this would be the one verse that would get repeated over and over again, but this is week number 3, and it'll probably be a different verse from Hebrews 11 next week. But this is our third week running with this verse, Hebrews 11, 29. It says, by faith, the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land. But when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land, but when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. Natasha she's a proofreader, and she proofreads my social media posts. If ever something goes up and comes down, it's probably because I didn't run it past her. She found a mistake, brought it to my attention. She proofreads basically all of the church's communication. So if you ever get communication from the church and there's a spelling mistake in it, it's not her fault. It means that we sent something and didn't ask her to look it over. She is militant. This girl, and if you know her for more than 7 or 8 minutes, she'll tell you that she got 100% on her English exam in grade 12. And she's like, who else got nobody else, just her. She got 100%. She has mastered the English language. She's perfect. Well, she was perfect in grade 12. And at the English, I'm not slighting her. That's an accomplishment. Man, you guys are so sensitive. You're down. I haven't mastered. I never got 100% on any English exams. Still have mistakes in a lot of my posts. But I'm just learning. You might know this. But it's pretty new information to me that you only need one space after a period. Did you know that? It's messing with me. I'm glad you feel the same. She's been telling me for a couple of years, hey, stop it. You're putting too many spaces after the period. I'm like, no, I'm not. I know this. This I learned, and I know it for sure. Period. 2 spaces, exclamation, 2 spaces, question mark. I know you end a sentence with a punctuation mark thing, something, and you 2 spaces. I know that. And then I started to see culture turn on me. I saw a meme that said, nothing says you're over 40 like leaving 2 spaces after a period. Now, what is going on? Are we just redoing the entire English language now because some millennials thought this is inconvenient? Like, I'm having a hard time with this. Turns out it's a typewriter thing, which, to be fair, I didn't learn how to type on a typewriter, everybody. I had a keyboarding class. It was a computer. We didn't have the internet when I was in high school, but we had computers. So I learned on a computer, but for some reason, in the 90s, they were still teaching you how to type on a computer the way they taught people how to type on a typewriter. I know it doesn't make any sense. So here we are, all of us over 40, victims of a flawed education system. That's what this is. Punctuation matters. I mean, you could say, without any punctuation, let's eat grandma, and it's pretty dark. That's pretty weird. You could say, let's eat comma grandma, and you're inviting her to dinner. It's totally different depending on where you put the punctuation. You could, if I were receiving an award, which I don't know why I would be, but I could say something like, I'd like to thank my parents, comma, Natasha, comma, and God. And you would think, oh, that's amazing. He's thanking his parents and his wife and his Savior. If I left one of the commas out, I would say, I'd like to thank my parents, Natasha, and God. And you'd be like, wow, is this another Immaculate Conception? Or his parents? Like, what? It's weird. The punctuation matters. You could say, I'm sorry, I love you with no punctuation, and it sounds like, well, I really regret the fact that we're in this relationship. You could say, I'm sorry, semicolon, I love you, and you've got two independent thoughts that are connected in the subject, which I'm sorry, I also love you. Changes everything. And Hebrews chapter 11, verse 29 drops a semicolon right in the middle of the verse, which lets us know that there are two independent thoughts connected to the same subject matter. Now, English teachers, don't come at me later. Just let me talk, okay? It says, by faith, the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land, semicolon. So, thank you, Jareen. Semicolon. So that's one thought. But then the semicolon is like, wait, there's more, like an infomercial, okay? So the semicolon says, wait, there's more. This is, but when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. You've got two independent clauses connected by the semicolon. So they're related, but they're different. Semicolon is an interesting piece of punctuation. The only one that has really made it into pop culture as a great tattoo option. A lot of people, I almost didn't talk about tattoos today because I talked about tattoos last week, and I probably talk about them too often. Did you know that way back in the early days of VC, we had one of the small groups was running, and somebody sent me pictures from the small group during the small group. Turns out they had hired a mobile tattoo artist to come to small group that night, and people were all getting inked up at small group. Just beautiful, right? So I'm just saying we could bring it back. It's in our DNA. But the semicolon tattoo is an interesting tattoo, and maybe you've got it, and I'm not sure exactly what it would mean to you, but the general idea is that you need to keep going. Like you're a survivor. Like the one actual definition or explanation of the semicolon tattoo I found says, the author could have stopped the sentence with a period, but there's a semicolon because you need to keep going, and then it says you're the author. Now the difference today is that the author is not you. The author is not me. And the fact that God has put a semicolon in here reminds me that whatever you face and whatever you've gone through, there's actually more to your story. And the good news is you don't have to write the narrative on your own, because we have an author and finisher of our faith who says, hey, I know it's been tough. I know it's been difficult. I know it's been trying. I know it's been a season. But boom, semicolon, that's not it. That's one independent clause. That's one moment of your life. That's one season of hardship. But I have something else I want to do. There's more to the story. And so I want to pick up the story of the Israelites as they cross over the Red Sea from Exodus chapter 14, verse 21. We talked last week about the encounter Moses had with the Israelites as they were preparing to cross. Well, now we'll see that they've made their way to the other side. It says, then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove back the sea with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. Now, when it says that they went through the Red Sea, they went through it, we might be tempted to reduce our understanding of the events to a one-night march across divinely divided waters. And well, in a sense, that is what historically happened. It represents so much more for the Israelites. Because it's not that they just went through the sea. They had been through a lot. They were coming out of Egypt, but bringing with them the baggage, the weight, the extra cargo of generational trauma. What they had been through in Egypt, in slavery, 430 years in Egypt, 400 years as slaves, what they had been through was incredibly traumatic. The idea of physical trauma. There's any doctors, nurses, anybody in our church, and we do have so many that work in the medical field, paramedics, people that work in the ER. When you talk physical trauma unit, it's because somebody gets rushed in and they have suffered physical trauma, like an impact, a blow, a strike that has altered something in their physical makeup. It's a serious injury, it's a serious wound. And I think to have a picture of trauma in that sense, of physical trauma, like what would it take for you to be admitted to the hospital because of physical trauma. That is a serious blow to your body. Now, with that picture, understand that we have not just physical trauma, but we deal with psychological trauma all the time. And so psychological trauma is an event or incident, and the degree of which has actually damaged the soul. Okay, so I say that because it's a lot more likely that those of us in the room and watching online today are not in the moment suffering from physical trauma. And maybe you are, and maybe you're in a hospital and you're with us, and that's amazing. But there is a much greater likelihood that there are people in the room who have been through it, like the Israelites, and are today carrying with them signs of psychological trauma. That your soul has been injured. Your soul and your spirit has been wounded. Who you are on the inside has been negatively impacted by a series of events. And then there's different types of trauma. There's chronic trauma, which is repeated exposure to the same type of mistreatment, to the same type of abuse, to the same type of impact. There's acute trauma, which is a single, isolated, stressful, or dangerous event. There's complex trauma, which is the result of exposure to multiple traumatic events. And listen, I'm not trying to be, this is not going to end down, okay? It's not a downer of a talk. But I want to just level the playing field. And hey, maybe this isn't for everybody. Maybe you're at a spot today where you're like, man, everything's been so good. And I am so good. And my soul is amazing. And there's nothing negative has ever happened to me. And I'm not carrying anything from my past ever. Why would anybody do that? So destructive. That's not me. I am amazing. I've been made like Christ. I'm basically him. And I'm fine. Maybe that's you. But if there's anybody else here, and at some level you've been through it, then we have to take a moment to acknowledge that maybe there's trauma. It might be macro trauma. It might be micro trauma. The worst thing you can do when you have physical trauma is not get it checked. Back in the day when I played hockey, I don't know how many concussions I had. We didn't check on trauma the same way 30 years ago as we do today. That's probably why my English isn't as good as my wife's. Things don't always make sense. And it would be impossible to fully unpack the layers and degrees of trauma that the Israelites were exposed to. And just like it would be impossible to do justice to the different complexities of traumatic events that we have all walked through. The Bible doesn't give us all the details, but it does give us a few, and it's important to understand so we can fully appreciate what's really being said when Exodus 14:22 says the Israelites went through. What did they go through? Well, they had been displaced. They were aliens in a foreign land, so their identity was traumatized. It had been stripped away. They didn't know who they really were, generation after generation. That not only was their trauma in the area of their identity, but they felt inadequate. Pharaoh had intentionally given them a list of work to do, needed them to make bricks, but then he withheld straw so that they had to make bricks, but they didn't have all the things they needed to make them. It's difficult to do a job when you don't have all the things necessary to complete the task. And so there might even be somebody in the room today, and you just look at like every day like that. Like, I don't actually have what I need to get through. I don't actually have the things I need to be successful. I don't think I have the tools to be a parent. I don't know if I even have the tools for a healthy relationship. I don't know if I even have the tools to break off these bad habits and move forward. You just feel inadequate. It might not be a big deal in a moment, but when it becomes a season or even a lifetime of feeling like I don't have what it takes, it ends up manifesting as insecurity. Insufficiency, that's traumatic. They were rejected. They were isolated. It was generations of physical abuse, psychological manipulation and oppression, 400 years of slavery, 430 years of being displaced, God silent, not hearing his voice, no clear direction, no clear purpose, only an empty promise of better days that echoed further and further into the distant past with each changing generation. Now, the bad news, of course, is that they had to go through the trauma. And we wouldn't wish the type of trauma they had to endure on anybody. The good news you can probably guess it, is that they went through the trauma. It didn't kill them. They made it through. And here we find them on the other side of the Red Sea, symbolically on the other side of what was a very traumatic experience. And God is going to establish his people. It's a brand new day. He's building a new nation. He's fulfilling promises. And we talked last week about how everything that we face has to go through God to get to you. And if that's the case, then you and I can go to God to get through it. And so it's encouraging on one hand to know that I can go to God to get through it. The complexity is that everybody has navigated a different pile of it. We all have different it that we've had to deal with. In this, hey, I'm being very serious. You've got your own it. Just worry about yourself. Maybe it's, the fact that this weekend is 2 years since 2 weeks to flatten the curve. Maybe that's your it. Maybe it could be that there's been other circumstances and situations that you've been navigating. There are some traumas, like I said, there are some macro pieces where we all walk through the same thing. And that's true. All of the Israelites walked through it. But they didn't all walk through it the same. We don't get all of the details, do we? We don't know who was walking through with an injury, and so it took them longer and they had to work harder to try and keep up. We don't know. We don't know who was walking through and they were emotionally wounded and they just kept doubting that it was even going to work and saw the walls of water on either side and thought, I'm doomed. We don't know. You don't know who was walking through it with a newborn that was crying like, shh, 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 shh. We don't know. You don't know who was walking through it with difficulty in a marriage relationship. Thinking like, oh my goodness, I don't even know if I want to get through it. They're all walking through it, but they're all walking through it differently. And that's the problem with how things go in the world. There are some things at a macro level that we all walk through. Inflation. You took out a mortgage so you could close a deal on a tank of gas. I get it. That's rough. Things in a political sphere, nationally, sure, we all walk through some of those things. Global issues, conflict, pandemic, all that stuff. We all walk through that in a sense, but it gets really difficult because as much as we all walk through that, we all walk through it differently. And you got your own things that you're carrying through what we all have to process. And so just because we find ourselves in the same storm doesn't mean that we're in the same vessel. And it's really easy to be navigating something and looking over and think that everybody else is in a cruise liner and you're in a rowboat. And it can be frustrating. Because maybe while we've all gone through it, you were going through it with a health diagnosis. Maybe while we're all going through it, you're going through it with a broken relationship and a failed marriage. Maybe while we're all going through it, you've got a child who's sick. Maybe while we're all going through it, you've got children who have rebelled. Maybe while we're all going through it, you lost somebody. Maybe while we're all going through it, you're dealing with mental illness and you're feeling overwhelmed and stressed out and anxious. We don't all go through it the same. And when you're going through it, it's really easy to feel like, man, this is unique to me. I wonder if there's something wrong with me. I wonder if there's something wrong with my faith. How come I'm the only one who wants to give up? How come I'm the only one who's having a hard time believing that things could ever get better? It's not just you. We're all going through it. We just all go through it differently. And so the bad news is that we will all go through it. The good news is that even though sometimes it hits the fan, you made it through. You're here. You made it through. And your story isn't over. There's not a period. It's not God's whole purpose and plan in your life is not just to get you through it, end of story. It's to get you through it and then to get you on to the next thing that he created you for. You are resilient. You're a survivor. The best is yet to come. God brought me through so that he could bring me into the plans and purposes he created me for. The story isn't over yet. In the same way that he was establishing the nation of Israel, I believe that God is establishing people right here, right now in this season. That he is fulfilling promises, that he is getting ready for his glory and his fame to be put on display in and through your life. So it's not that we just made it through. We have to look beyond making it through and look ahead to what else God is doing. And so we pick up the story of the Israelites. Now they've crossed over to the other side of the Red Sea. And Exodus chapter 14, verse 23 says, now they've crossed over. This is a major miracle. Waters, whoosh, people, they're over. But it says the Egyptians pursued them, and all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. The Israelites are on the other side of the Red Sea, but the Egyptians are still coming. So the traumatic situation is technically over. They're free from slavery. They're free from captivity. They are their own people. They're no longer slaves. But the instrument that brought all of the trauma is still chasing them. And it can feel that way sometimes. It's almost like this is a living picture of what it is to have some PTSD. And I'm not a psychologist. I'm not bringing up the idea of PTSD to downplay it in any way, shape, or form. But I do believe it's important to talk about, because if we don't talk about it, we can't address it. If we can't address it, we can't get past it. We can't get healed. And so there's a real sense that even though an event might be over, we are still dealing with lingering side effects of what was a difficult season. So it's a very real thing. And if we did a quick review of our own lives, we might even see some signs of a little Red Sea PTSD in our own lives. The signs of post-traumatic stress disorder, isolation. Like just feeling alone and the desire to socially and emotionally detach from other people. Flashbacks, negative memories, negative thoughts you can't seem to escape. They're haunting you. They're just there all the time, over and over and over. Lack of rest, insomnia, a common sign that there's some post-traumatic stress. Lack of purpose and motivation, like I'm here, but I have no idea what I'm here for. Easily triggered, angry, coping, trying to escape our emotions and do something just to numb how we actually feel so we can function. And so when we talk about how Israel got out of Egypt, this is like a very churchy thing. And so if you're not churchy, welcome. And if you've never heard this before, that's probably a good thing. But it's often said about the Israelites, the Israelites got out of Egypt, but then they had to get Egypt out of them. Right? That's the thing. So it's important to know a couple church things. That's a church thing. So if you ever want to, just impress people with church things, you'd be like, yeah, but the Israelites, hey, they got out of Egypt, but they had to get Egypt out of them. It's okay. So you're welcome. But you know what? The more I look at this and realize that psychological trauma damages your soul, it becomes easy to understand how they could have been out of Egypt but still had the implications and impact of Egypt weighing heavy on their souls. They had damaged souls. The thing with having a damaged soul is that a change of scenery doesn't make it any better. Just because they weren't working making bricks anymore, now they're on the other side of the Red Sea, doesn't mean that the damage that had been done to their soul has been repaired. When your soul has been traumatized, it can look like you're healed up and freed up on the outside, but you can still be fighting battles no one else can see and nobody else can understand. It's really easy to rally sympathy and support when you're talking about an obvious physical injury. When the trauma is physical in nature, it's easy to be like, oh yeah, well, of course we're going to help that person. We get that. But it's very different when the trauma is now manifesting on the inside as loneliness and memories you can't shake and exhaustion and anger and addiction and coping and frustration and feeling constantly overwhelmed. It's different when it's on the inside. It can feel like nobody notices. But then we read verse 24. The Egyptians are in pursuit, but it says during the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and the cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. He jammed the wheels of their chariots that they had difficulty driving, and the Egyptians said, "Let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." I hate being in the dark. Not so much physical dark. Not that I, I'm not Batman. I don't live in a cave. We have lights. I could be Batman if I wanted to. It's just training and some money. That's fine. I don't mind being in the dark. Obviously it's best to sleep in the dark and all those things. But I don't like being out of the loop. I don't like being in the dark. I don't like being out of the know. It's every time, and I feel confident saying this is like both of us. But every time Natasha gets a text message, I'm like, "Hey, what's that? What's happening?" It's like, "It's my mom." "Okay, cool. What'd she say?" "Two have become one. I have the right to know what's going on." And before you think like, "Oh, he's controlling," she does the same thing. You try and get 5 minutes of peace. She's right there. "Hey, what's going on? What are you doing?" "I'm just thinking." And as much as that's us, what we've noticed is that we've really passed that on, especially to our second child, AZ, very inquisitive. She pops up everywhere. Like she's as close to omnipresent as I've ever seen. Like she's always like, "Hey guys, what are you talking about? Hey, what's that text message about? Hey, is something going on at the church? Hey, what's the problem? Hey, is somebody in trouble? Hey, what's that?" Like just nonstop. And then like this week, she's like, "Mom won't let me see her text messages." I'm like, "That's because you're not Mom." She's like, "Yeah, but I need to know what's going on." I'm like, "No, you don't." She's like, "Well, I live in this house." I'm like, "You won't if you keep it up." She hates being in the dark. Always got to know. And what's interesting about this, it says during the last watch of the night, so it's still dark. Another translation says just before dawn, like just before the light breaks. What the Israelites don't know is that while the Egyptians are pursuing them in the dark, God sees. While the Egyptians are pursuing the Israelites in the dark, God takes notice and throws their whole plan into a cycle of confusion and chaos. You know what? I love that language because if you fast forward to the New Testament and you go to the book of John, chapter 20, it starts off by saying, while it was still dark, a couple of women came to the tomb and noticed that the stone had been rolled away. And we understand and begin to learn that God does some of his best work in environments where we can't see and we don't know all of the details and we can't predict what's going to happen. While it's still dark, when it doesn't make sense to me, God is moving on my behalf. When I can't see the way, God is making a way. God is working even when I can't see what he's doing to thwart, that's a good word, thwart, the plans of the enemy. I don't even know where that word came from. It's not like that's in my regular vocabulary. I will not be thwarted. He's working in the dark on your behalf, on my behalf. He doesn't just see us through to the other side. He sees you in the dark, knows exactly what the struggle is, knows exactly what the concerns are, and is moving on our behalf to make a way. And that's the really frustrating thing about God is he's always willing to make a way. He's never going to tell you the way he's going to make. He's not going to let you pick it. You just have to trust that he's going to give you a way. It says, then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and their horsemen. So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak, the sea went back into its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and the horsemen. The entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea, not one of them survived. But the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. That day, the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. Now, just try and make sense of this scene with me just for a minute. God says to Moses, here's what I want you to do. You've come through, you're on the other side. I want you to take your staff, I want you to take your hand, I want you to raise it up back over the sea. Like, do it again. Because this is the same instruction he gave him on the other side, right? Like before they crossed. He said the same thing. I want you to take your staff, I want you to raise your hand, I want you to raise it up over the sea. The first time Moses did this, it enabled the Israelites to walk through where they should not have been able to walk through. Moses raised up his hand, and he did it for the deliverance of his people. That was the moment that they went from slave to free. That was the moment they crossed over. It was significant. God demonstrating his power and establishing Moses as a credible leader. It's a significant moment. But now, from basically every angle I can imagine, I don't see the need for Moses to do this again. They're on the other side. It's cool that he could be like whoosh on one side and then whoosh on the other. I get it's cool. It's a neat trick. But it's all the power of God anyhow. We know that Moses, in and of himself or in his staff, in his hand, did not have the power to change the flow of the sea. We get that. God didn't need Moses to look back over the water and raise up his hand again. He could have just let them keep going, like they're on the other side. In fact, it seems to be a little bit of a shift in God's perspective, because you'll remember last week we talked about Exodus chapter 14, verse 14. We're not going to show it. That's fine. Don't worry. But how Moses said, you need only to be still. And God was like, nah, you need to move on. And so it's funny to me that on one side, God's like, no, don't stand still. Tell them to keep moving. And then you get to the other side. They're on the other side of the Red Sea. The promised land is ahead of them. Like, you would think that the same instruction from God would apply. Keep going. Don't stop. Nobody says stop. Look back and raise your hand over the sea. God, why do you want them to stop and look back and raise his hand over the sea? I don't. And then as I was thinking about this, because it didn't make sense to me, God brought me back to Exodus chapter 14, verse 13. This one we do have. In the English Standard Version, it says, fear not, this is Moses talking, stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. I told you this last week, that not everything Moses said was wrong. In fact, it was all right. Just the part about standing still wasn't right in that moment. This is all right. Stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord. Okay, so the goal was that the people would see the salvation of the Lord. When Moses raised up his hand the first time, they crossed over. They were delivered from their captivity and freed from their oppression. That was the first step of seeing the salvation of the Lord. But do you know that there's more to salvation than just being free from sin? God needed Moses to look back over the sea, raise up his hand again, and watch while the water flowed back over the enemy. Waited until daybreak. God wasn't going to do this bit of work at night. He needed the Israelites to see this. He wanted them to see what was happening. That the complete work of salvation was not just the deliverance of the Israelites from captivity. The complete work of salvation was the deliverance of the Israelites and the destruction of their enemy. Their captor, the enemy, the symbol of death and pain and loss. He said, no, I need you to watch while I take care of the thing that traumatized you. I need you to watch while I make sure that what traumatized you in one season will not traumatize you again. I need you to watch and see that when I set you free, you are really free. Him who the Son sets free is free indeed. That doesn't just mean you're free for a moment. It means he can free you for a lifetime. And we got to watch and see. What I wanted you to see, Moses, that when I delivered you, I also had a plan to destroy your enemy. Do you know 32 times in Scripture the Israelites are encouraged to remember the complete work of the Red Sea? 32 times when they're facing trial, opposition, persecution, frustration. Authors, prophets, songwriters come back to this moment and say, remember the Red Sea, where you were delivered and your enemy was destroyed. It's an encouragement to keep going. As the author of Hebrews is writing Hebrews chapter 11, he is putting two specific thoughts in there that are critical to the persecuted church that he's writing to at the time, being able to keep going. They are overwhelmed, they are oppressed, they are traumatized. And he says, listen, look back and remember that you've been delivered. Semicolon. There's more. Look back and remember that not only were you delivered, but the enemy that hunted you down and oppressed you has been defeated. You don't have to look over your shoulder. You don't have to worry about that enemy again. There is healing for your soul so you can move forward. What you're facing now, you will not have to face again. Look back and remember. Interesting, as I was studying chapter 14, verse 13, I noticed the word salvation in the Hebrew is made up of 3 different Hebrew letters. You got like a minute just for a quick lesson in Hebrew? I hope my Hebrew is better than my English. The 3 symbols, the 3 Hebrew letters that make up the word salvation, is the symbol He, which means revelation, the symbol Vav, which means nail, and the symbol Yod, which means hand. This is like 1,800 years before Jesus. And the word that Moses says to the people is, look and see the revelation of the nail-pierced hand. Look and see. It is a prophetic foreshadowing of what Jesus would accomplish for us on the cross. Look and see. And every time in their history that they look back to the Red Sea, it's not just remember the waters and how they parted. It's look and see the revelation of the nail-pierced hand. Look and see the salvation of Yeshua. Look and see. Don't forget. Oh, it's so easy to forget. We live in a time and a culture when it's so easy for us to forget. As we've watched in this last season, friends, loved ones, even members of this community shift in and out of a belief with God. You just want to sit down and have a conversation. Don't forget. It's crazy that we can have a lifetime of positive memories and have one negative experience, and that dominates the airwaves of our minds, so that we want to walk away from Christ and don't feel like we can move forward. But Moses says, no, see the salvation. See the revelation of the nail-pierced hand. Listen, don't forget. God gets them to stop intentionally and say, hey, look back and remember. I want you to see the whole thing. I want you to see that the work I've done in you is a completed work. I want you to see that I've delivered you and I've destroyed the thing that hunts you down. Hebrews 10 verse 12 says, but when Christ had offered for all time a single sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of God, waiting from that time until his enemies should be made a footstool for his feet. For by a single offering he has perfected or made complete for all time those who are being sanctified. It is the complete work of Jesus on display through the Red Sea. The instruction to Moses and the Israelites was stop, look back over the place that you crossed, and recognize that I delivered you and I destroyed your enemies in the place where you crossed. And Jesus instructs us to do the same. Look back to the place of the cross and recognize that in the place of the cross, I not only delivered you and freed you and lifted off guilt and shame and condemnation, but I rose again on the 3rd day and I destroyed the very death that wants to hunt you down. It is the complete work of salvation that God hasn't just brought us into freedom, but in destroying death, he can heal our souls. there's salvation, and there's healing. How therapeutic do you think it was for the Israelites to watch the thing that had tormented them for generations wash up lifeless? I'm telling you, the sin that has tormented us, we're not just free from it, but it is powerless through the cross of Jesus Christ. Powerless through the cross. And there's somebody in the room today, and you need to remember. Because conceptually, you know, yeah, I'm set free. I gave my life to Jesus. I come to church. But there's a struggle that keeps pursuing you. There's thoughts that keep coming back. There's a way of life. There's these things that you've had a hard time shaking. And I believe God brought you into the room today just to remind you that's dead too. That's dead too. You don't have to worry any longer. 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Oh, where death is your sting. Oh, where death is your victory. It can't hurt you anymore. And that's why we look back to the cross. And so today, because it's good for our soul, today, because I believe God is doing something brand new, today, because I believe he's got promises that have yet to be fulfilled, but they're on their way. Today, because I believe the plan he has for each person in this room is good and perfect. We're going to take a moment and we're going to remember not just the freedom from our sins, but the healing for all the traumatic experiences that our souls have had to go through, because death is dead.